You have been thinking about the distance wrong, not because you are naive, not because you have not read enough or sat with this long enough or done enough inner work to understand what is happening. You have done the work. You have sat with the silence. You have moved through weeks and months of it, feeling the particular texture of a gap that should not exist between two people who recognized each other the way you did. But the distance has been sitting in your mind as a fixed thing, a wall, a decision he made, a choice that has an explanation somewhere, one that he has either given you or withheld, and that explanation is the thing you keep reaching for when the nights get quiet, as though understanding the reason for the distance would finally dissolve the ache of it. Here's what nobody tells you. The distance is not made of his decision. It is not made of bad timing or wrong circumstances or any of the reasons that have been offered by him or by yourself for why things are the way they are right now. The distance between you is made of something much older than this connection, something that was already present in both of you, already operational, already running quietly underneath everything long before you ever found each other. And the reason this matters, the reason understanding the actual composition of the distance changes everything about how you hold it, is this: what is made of old material can be moved by new understanding. What feels like a wall between you is actually more like a field, a specific kind of force field with a particular interior structure. And when you understand what it is actually made of, it stops being something you are simply waiting on the other side of. If you have been feeling the distance between you this week and finding yourself genuinely unable to explain what is keeping it in place, leave a like and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Drop "I see what this is made of" in the comments. Because what Mars conjunct Saturn is doing in the collective field right now has a direct application to exactly this: the specific architecture of the gap between you, what is holding it open, and what actually, in real terms, begins to close it. There is something I want to put directly in your hands before we go further. Because if you have been sitting inside this distance for any length of time, you know that general content reaches a ceiling. It explains things in ways that feel true but stay abstract. What you actually need is a specific map, the one built from your chart, your birth information, the exact cosmic architecture of your particular connection and what the current field is doing inside it. A twin flame union personal reading is not a forecast. It is a reckoning. Your name, your birth, date, your exact time, your place. 4 pieces of information that become the foundation of a reading built around nobody else's journey but yours. What is currently running between you energetically, where you actually are in the journey, what the karmic pattern underneath the surface of this connection genuinely looks like, and what the universe is constructing in the space between you right now that you cannot see from inside the experience. You receive a personal audio reading to your inbox plus a full written PDF report, something to hold and return to, within 48 hours. The link is in the description. If you have been asking whether what you are sensing is real, this will answer that from the level where it is actually happening. Start here because this matters. The distance between you is not indifference. If it were indifference, it would not produce what it produces in him. Indifference is quiet. It settles. It does not generate the particular restlessness you can feel in his field, even when the surface of his life looks entirely composed. Indifference does not require management. A man who feels nothing about a person does not need to build an elaborate internal architecture to maintain the feeling of nothing. He just feels nothing. It costs him very little. He moves on. That is not what is happening here. The distance is also not clarity. Not in the sense he may have told himself. Clarity has a quality of settledness to it. A person who is genuinely clear about a decision does not need to revisit it internally. Does not need the distance to remain absolute in order to feel safe. Does not have the particular quality of guardedness around even the mention of the connection that you may have noticed when you have been in proximity to him. Clarity feels like relief. What he is carrying does not feel like relief. It feels like effort. And the distance is not, despite how it may appear from where you are standing. evidence that the connection was less than you understood it to be. Here is what the research on attachment actually shows. The magnitude of the avoidance response in a person with an avoidant or fearful avoidant attachment style is not inversely related to how much they feel. It is directly related to it. The more the connection matters, the more activated the avoidant response becomes. Not because they want to hurt the person they are pulling away from, because the depth of feeling is the specific thing that activates the old fear. The fear that was calibrated to exactly this amount of closeness, this much realness, this degree of being genuinely known. And the withdrawal is the system's oldest and most reliable answer to that level of activation. The distance is made of fear, not the fear of you specifically, fear of what you represent, what the connection activates in him at a level far older than you, far older than this relationship, far older than anything either of you has consciously created together. To understand what the distance is actually constructed from, you have to go back further than this connection. Both of you entered this dynamic carrying relational blueprints, internal working models as attachment theory calls them. These are not beliefs in the intellectual sense. They are not things you chose or decided or could easily articulate if someone asked you to. They are structural, laid down in the earliest relational experiences, in the first few years of life when the nervous system was learning its most fundamental lessons about what closeness feels like, whether it is safe, what it costs, and what happens to a person who reaches toward another and finds something other than reliable warmth. For the divine feminine in this connection, that blueprint often carries a specific shape. The shape of a person who learned early that love comes with conditions attached, who learned to be attuned to others as a strategy for maintaining connection, who became very good at reading rooms, managing emotions, anticipating needs, being less inconveniently herself than she might otherwise have been in order to preserve the closeness that felt essential, not because she was weak, because she was adaptive, because her nervous system was learning to survive in the relational environment it found itself in. And that blueprint is running right now, today, underneath every interaction and every non-interaction and every careful parsing of a message received or not received. The part of her that is sitting at the edge of the distance is the part that learned early that connection is something that can disappear, and that vigilance is the closest available substitute for the security she is actually longing for. For the divine masculine, the blueprint often carries a different shape. The shape of a person who learned that the full weight of his emotional interior was not something the environment could reliably hold, who learned to manage his inner world as a condition of being acceptable, who internalized, not through one dramatic event, but through the cumulative impressions of ordinary moments in early relationships, that the depth of what he feels is something to be contained rather than expressed, that vulnerability has costs, that the specific kind of closeness where someone sees all the way into the interior of a person and knows exactly what they find is the most dangerous form of contact available. And so he built a system, a sophisticated, deeply practiced, internally consistent system for maintaining enough distance between his interior life and the people around him that no one ever fully arrives at the place where the real fear lives. Until you. This is the part that explains the intensity of the dynamic and the specific quality of the distance simultaneously. You got through in a way that no one else had. Not because you were better or more persistent or more spiritually evolved. Because the soul-level recognition that twin flame connections are characterized by does not operate through the managed exterior. It goes straight through it. It lands in the interior, in the unguarded place, in the space that exists before the coping mechanism has had time to activate. He felt something in the specific direction of you that the system had never been required to respond to before. A quality of being seen that his management strategies were not designed to handle. Because they were designed to handle people who were seeing the exterior, the performance, the curated version. And what you encountered from the very beginning of whatever this was between you was not his exterior. Something in you was oriented directly toward the interior, toward the self underneath the management, toward the version of him that he had kept most carefully protected for the longest time. That is the recognition. That is the felt sense of it in a twin flame connection that distinguishes it from every other relational experience either person has had. It is not the superficial click of compatible personalities. It is the specific, disorienting experience of being encountered at the level beneath the performance by someone who appears, from the inside, to see you accurately, to know you without being told, to reach in a direction that lands not on what you present but on what you actually are. For a system built on managing access to the interior, this is not comfortable, even when it feels, in the first moments of recognition, like relief. Like coming home to something you had been missing without knowing its name. Even then, the system is registering the threat. The depth of the recognition is the depth of the exposure. And a nervous system organized around protecting that interior from full exposure does not simply dismantle its architecture because the person who found the gap happens to feel like home. It doubles down. The closeness that feels like recognition on one level registers as maximum threat on another. And the system that has been operational for decades, the one that was built in circumstances where the threat was real, does not wait to evaluate whether this particular person is actually dangerous before it activates its oldest responses. The distance is the oldest response. On April 19th, 2026, Mars and Saturn are exactly conjunct in Aries. This is not a soft transit. Mars and Saturn together in the same degree of the same sign create an energy that is simultaneously urgent and obstructed. The forward thrust of Mars, its instinctive need to move, to act, to break through whatever is in the way, meets the structural weight of Saturn, its insistence on consequence, on responsibility, on the reality of whatever has been deferred or avoided or left unresolved. Aries is the first sign, the sign of the self, of individual identity, of the impulse that moves before thought catches up with it. Both Mars and Saturn here in Aries are operating in territory that is fundamentally about the self in relation to its own forward momentum, what the self wants to do and what the self has not yet done, and the specific friction between those two things. For a twin flame dynamic that has been characterized by distance and deferral, this transit is not abstract. The Mars energy is the forward pull. The thing that has been wanting to move in his direction, in her direction, in the direction of the connection itself. The force that has been pressing against the walls of the structure he built. It is the part of him that recognized you. The part that knows. The part that has been maintaining a low but persistent pressure against the inside of the distance this entire time. The Saturn energy is the structure, the weight of everything that has been constructed to hold the distance in place. The commitments to the narrative, the long practice of the management strategy, the specific inertia of a person who has organized their life around maintaining a certain distance and for whom the reconfiguration of that distance would require confronting everything the distance was built to avoid. When Mars meets Saturn in exact conjunction, what is produced is neither pure forward movement nor pure obstruction. It is pressure, the specific sensation of force meeting resistance and neither having the obvious upper hand. And in the interior of a person who is in this dynamic, that pressure has a quality. It feels like something that cannot keep building indefinitely. Like sapling is about to require resolution, not because resolution has been chosen, but because the pressure has reached the level where continuing to hold it static becomes its own form of movement. Today, in the collective field, something is pressing. Something that has been deferred is meeting the reality of its own deferral. The forward pull of what is true and the structural weight of what has been maintained in its place are in direct contact with each other. That contact is happening in both of you. You have been managing your own version of this, not identically to his. The content is different. The behavioral expression is different. But the underlying dynamic is more parallel than most content in this space acknowledges. Because the anxious-avoidant pattern that shows up in twin flame dynamics is not simply a story of one person who feels everything and one person who feels nothing. It is a story of two people who are both, in different ways, organized around fear of the specific depth of contact this connection is asking for. For the divine feminine, The fear is often less visible because it is organized around reaching rather than withdrawing. She reaches toward him. She feels the pull. She moves in the direction of the connection. And it looks from the outside like the opposite of fear. It looks like openness, like willingness, like the absence of the avoidance pattern. But underneath the reaching is the same thing that is underneath his withdrawal, the wound that does not feel safe existing alone without the confirmation of the connection. The fear that her own interior, without the anchor of his presence or the promise of his presence, is not sufficient. That she requires the specific form of completion that this connection has always seemed to promise in order to feel fully real. This is not a flaw. This is the other half of the same architecture. John Bowlby, who first developed the theoretical framework of attachment theory in the 1950s and 60s, understood that the attachment behavioral system was fundamentally a proximity-seeking system. When the system detects threat, the instinct is to move toward the attachment figure, to reach, to close the gap, to restore contact with the person whose presence carries the felt sense of safety. And when the attachment figure is unavailable, the system escalates its efforts, not because the escalation is irrational, because from inside the system's framework, escalating is the correct response to a proximity threat. The anxious attachment response and the avoidant attachment response are mirror images of the same underlying structure. Both are organized around fear of loss, around the wound of insufficient or conditional early attachment, around a self that learned something specific about whether it could rely on closeness to be available when needed. The anxious response says, if I release the reaching, I will lose the connection, and losing the connection is the thing my system cannot survive. The avoidant response says, if I allow the closeness, I will lose myself inside it, and losing myself is the thing my system cannot survive. Two people moving toward and away from each other, each driven by a version of the same fear, each making the other's fear worse by their response to their own. That is what the distance is made of. That is the field between you. Here is what the research on attachment actually tells us about this dynamic, and here is why it matters for where you are right now. The anxious-avoidant trap, as attachment researchers have named it, is self-sustaining. The more the anxious partner reaches, the more the avoidant partner withdraws. The more the avoidant partner withdraws, the more activated the anxious partner system becomes, which produces more reaching, which produces more withdrawal. The cycle generates its own momentum, and it continues not because either person is choosing it, but because both nervous systems are responding to each other's cues in the ways they were wired to respond. What breaks the cycle is not the avoidant partner suddenly deciding to stop avoiding. It is not the anxious partner successfully convincing the avoidant partner that the closeness is safe. Both of those approaches are attempts to work within the cycle rather than step outside it. What actually interrupts the pattern is a shift in the signal. When the reaching stops, not as a strategy, not as a calculated withdrawal designed to trigger a response, but as a genuine consequence of the anxious partner beginning to find inside themselves something that does not require constant external confirmation to remain stable, the signal the avoidant partner's nervous system has been responding to changes. The incoming data that was registering as pressure, as demand, as the specific kind of closeness that activates the withdrawal response is no longer arriving at the same intensity. And something interesting happens in the avoidance system when the pressure drops. The defense that was organized in relation to the pressure does not know what to do when the pressure is no longer there. The withdrawal was a response to a specific input. When the input changes, the response that was calibrated to it becomes inappropriate to the new situation. And underneath the withdrawal response, underneath the management strategy and the distance and the constructed narrative about why the gap is reasonable, there is the original recognition, the one that got through the system in the first place. The one that still knows. When the pressure of the reaching quiets, that recognition becomes more audible, not immediately, not in a way that produces instant action, but in the specific way that a person who has been braced against an incoming force notices, when the force shifts, that they have been holding their breath. He is in that moment. He may not know why the quality of the field has changed. He may not have language for the specific sensation of the distance feeling different, of the familiar pressure being less insistent, of something in the direction of you being quieter in a way that is, paradoxically, harder to ignore than the reaching was. But the nervous system registers what the mind does not yet have words for. Something in him is listening for you in a different way right now, not for the reaching, for the signal underneath it. This is practical, specific. You have been sending signals you did not know you were sending, not in the obvious ways, not necessarily in the explicit reaching out or the obvious monitoring. The signals travel through the field at the level of where your attention actually lives when no one is watching, where your internal orientation is set. Whether the background frequency of your daily experience is calibrated around him, and the question of him and the distance and what the distance means and when it might change, or whether it is calibrated around you. The field between deeply bonded pairs communicates continuously. This is not purely a spiritual claim. The interpersonal neurobiology literature, particularly the work of researchers like Daniel Siegel, documents extensively the degree to which emotionally significant people affect each other's nervous systems through non-verbal, non-proximity-based channels. The field of the connection carries information, and the information your field has been carrying is the information of reaching, of vigilance, of a system on alert for any change in the gap. That information lands in his field as pressure, even at a distance, even without contact, even when you believe you have been performing detachment successfully on the surface. What you need to stop doing is maintaining the internal orientation of waiting, not as a strategic move to trigger a shift in him, though the shift in him is likely to follow, but because the waiting is costing you something you cannot afford to keep spending. The waiting is organized around the premise that the resolution of this is in his hands, that what happens between you depends on a decision he makes, that your own interior completeness is contingent on whether he chooses to close the gap. That premise is the wound, not the love. The wound. The love is real. The love does not require the waiting. The love exists and continues to exist in a version of you that is not organized around whether he returns. The version of you that is moving in the direction of her own life, her own becoming, her own genuine interior fullness, is not a version that has given up on the connection. She is a version that is no longer asking the connection to hold her up. David Schnarch, whose work on differentiation in intimate relationships is among the most rigorous in the field, made a distinction that is directly relevant here. He differentiated between other validated intimacy and self-validated intimacy. Other validated intimacy requires that the other person confirm your worth, your realness, your lovability, in order for you to experience yourself as whole. Self-validated intimacy is the capacity to remain in genuine contact with your own experience, your own worth, your own emotional truth, whether or not the other person is present, available, or offering confirmation. The twin flame journey is, in its core structure, a curriculum in self-validated intimacy, not because union is not real or not coming, but because the version of you that arrives at union from a place of other validated dependency will produce the same dynamic inside the union that produced the separation outside it. The growth that the journey is asking for is the specific growth of a self that does not require external validation as its primary structural support. When that growth becomes genuine rather than performed, the field changes. And the field changing is what moves the dynamic. You have been doing this work. You have been showing up for the journey, sitting with the uncertainty, doing the interior labor of a process that does not come with a timeline or a guarantee. And somewhere inside all of that, the question has probably surfaced: am I actually progressing, or am I spinning in the same territory? The Twin Flame Journey Tracker and Progress Workbook was built for exactly that question. 39 pages. An 8-stage journey tracker that shows you where you actually are on the map instead of guessing. A synchronicity log where you record the moments, the signs, the dreams, the 1111s, as they accumulate into a pattern you can actually see. A daily self-love checklist that keeps you as the center of your own story. Weekly reflection pages that reveal what you are living inside. Monthly reviews that show you in black and white how far you have moved. Information does not create transformation. Tracking does. The link is in the description. You need to understand something about avoidant attachment that most twin flame content does not get specific enough about. He is not comfortable. The distance that he has been maintaining does not feel from inside his experience like what it looks like from outside it. From outside, it looks like ease, like he has settled into the separation without significant interior disturbance. Like the life he is living at a distance from you is something he inhabits without the friction you experience on your side of the gap. That is not accurate. The avoidant attachment style does not produce the absence of emotional experience. It produces the suppression of emotional experience. These are significantly different things. A person who feels nothing is not suppressing anything. A person who has built a sophisticated system for managing what they feel, for regulating it downward before it can reach the surface, is carrying the full weight of the feeling plus the metabolic cost of the management. Polyvagal theory. Stephen Porges's framework for understanding how the autonomic nervous system regulates social engagement has something precise to say about this. Porges identified a ventral vagal circuit that supports what he called the social engagement system. The capacity to be present, open, in genuine contact with another person in the state of nervous system regulation that makes real intimacy available. Below that, when the system detects threat, the circuit drops into sympathetic activation, fight or flight, or further into a dorsal vagal freeze state. For a person with an avoidant attachment organization, the detection of deep relational closeness tends to trigger a dorsal vagal dropout, a shutdown of the social engagement system that protects the interior by making genuine contact temporarily unavailable, not as a conscious choice, as an automatic response. The system registers the level of closeness as beyond its window of tolerance and removes the capacity for engagement before the person is even aware of having felt the pull. What this means, practically, is that the moments when he has been most closed off, most distant, most apparently unaffected, are often the moments when he was most activated internally. The shutdown was the response to the intensity of what was present, not evidence that the intensity was not there. He is managing something larger than what is visible. The Mars-Saturn conjunction today in Aries, the sign of the raw unmanaged self, is pressing directly on the point where the managed version of himself and the unmanaged version are in the most tension. Mars wants to break through. Saturn is the management, and the management is effortful in a way that is costing him something. Day by day, in ways he does not have language for and would not offer if he did. His nervous system is tired, not tired of the connection, tired of managing it. There is a specific shift that happens in the field when the divine feminine stops organizing her interior life around interpreting and explaining the gap. You have been doing a particular kind of labor, the labor of trying to make sense of the distance in a way that does not cost you too much. The running of various explanatory frameworks over the experience to find the one that makes it most bearable. The checking of your own behavior and your own energetic output and your own emotional expression to see if something you did contributed to the gap. The periodic return to hope when something in the field shifts and the periodic collapse of that hope, when the shift does not become what you expected it to become. This labor is enormous. It runs continuously underneath whatever else you are doing with your life. It consumes attention and nervous system resources that your own becoming requires, and it sends a signal. The signal of a person whose attention is organized around the interpretation of external conditions rather than around the internal cultivation of their own selfhood. Differentiation theory, as developed by Murray Bowen and extended by David Schnarch, offers a concept that applies here with specific precision. The concept of the togetherness force and the individuality force. Bowen understood that in any intimate system, there are two simultaneous poles: the pole toward fusion, toward merger, toward organizing oneself in relation to the other, and the pole toward individuality, toward maintaining a distinct self within the connection. Healthy intimate systems require the capacity for both. In a twin flame dynamic in separation, the togetherness force has been dominant. The orientation toward him, the monitoring of his state, the interpretation of his signals or his silence, the calibration of your own emotional reality in relation to his position. This is togetherness force in its most activated form. It does not look like togetherness because the physical proximity is absent. But the interior organization, the centering of him as the primary reference point for your own emotional state, is precisely the togetherness pole operating at maximum strength. When the individuality force begins to genuinely reassert itself, when the interior reference point shifts from him to you, something changes in the quality of what you are carrying into the field. Not because you become less connected to the love, but because the love stops being the same thing as the reaching. The love and the reaching feel identical when the togetherness force is fully dominant. Releasing the reaching feels like releasing the love. It feels like betrayal or indifference or giving up. It is none of those things. The love is the soul-level recognition. It does not require the reaching to exist. It was present before the reaching, and it will be present when the reaching settles. The reaching is the wound's response to the love. And the wound's response has been mistaken for a very long time for the love itself. When you can feel the difference between the love and the reaching, when you can hold the love while letting the reaching settle, when the interior distinction between those two things becomes available to you as a lived experience rather than an intellectual concept, the field shifts. And in the field, he feels it, not as absence, as a different kind of presence. The presence of a person who is no longer organized around explaining the gap, who is no longer performing healing in the direction of the connection, who is simply, genuinely showing up for her own life in a way that is not about him and is therefore, paradoxically, more magnetic than anything she could have directed at him with intention. The distance between you is not permanent, not because reunion is guaranteed on a human-designed timeline, not because the love is sufficient to dissolve all the old fear in both nervous systems on its own, but because the specific structure that is holding the gap open is not a static structure, it is a dynamic one. It is responsive. It shifts in relation to the signals it receives, and the signals are changing. Mars conjunct Saturn in Aries today is not only about the friction of forward movement meeting structural resistance. It carries something else. When Mars and Saturn meet in exact conjunction, there is a quality of inevitability about what has been intention. The things that have been in conflict, the drive and the structure, the knowing and the management, the recognition and the defense, are in direct contact with each other. They cannot be maintained at a comfortable distance from each other anymore. That contact is productive even when it is uncomfortable. Aries is the sign of beginning, the sign that moves before thinking catches up. Both Mars and Saturn here are being asked to do their work in Aries territory. The action and the structure both situated in the field of new initiation, of the self stripped of its management, of what a person actually is before they have arranged themselves for presentation. In the interior of a man who has spent this entire separation arranged for presentation, this transit is pressing on the gap between what he has arranged and what he actually is. The gap that you have always been oriented toward. The gap where the recognition lives. He is closer to that gap than he has been, not because of anything you have done or not done this week, because the sky is pressing. Because the internal cost of maintaining the distance at its current level is increasing. Because the field has shifted in the direction of you, not through more reaching but through less, and the signal that has been received in his field is the signal of a person who is genuinely moving in her own direction, who is no longer primarily organized around the gap, whose presence in the field carries a different frequency than it did 6 months ago. And that frequency is the one his soul contract recognizes, not the reaching. What is underneath the reaching? The self that the journey has been building, the version of you that could not have existed without the separation, without the longing, without the specific passage through everything this distance has asked you to move through. That is the version of you that closes this gap, not by pursuing it closed, by becoming someone who no longer requires it to be open in order to keep moving. The distance is not made of his decision. It is made of old fear, meeting new love in two people who were not yet fully themselves when they found each other. and the self that is being built in you right now. Today, in the pressure and the quiet and the learning to hold the love without organizing your life around the gap. That self is what the distance is actually made of space for. It is making room for who you are becoming. And what you are becoming is exactly what the connection has been waiting for.